On July 15, 1982, the body of 16-year-old Wendy Caulfield was pulled from the Green River. She had been strangled. It was a tragic death, but in those first hours, it did not seem to police like anything more than another sad story of a troubled teenager whose life ended too soon. Just weeks later, however, another body appeared, and then another, and another. By August, the shallow waters of the Green River and its surrounding banks had revealed 5 victims, all young women, all strangled, and all with eerie similarities in how they were left. Some had been placed in clusters, almost staged. The victims shared more than a cause of death. Many were teenage runaways or sex workers, women whose daily lives left them vulnerable to predators. They had vanished from Seattle streets, often last seen accepting rides from strangers. Detectives quickly realized they were dealing with a single killer. But the clues were few. There were no witnesses who could provide a clear description of a suspect. The killer left no fingerprints, no weapon, no obvious trace of himself. For investigators, the river became both a crime scene and a graveyard. The muddy banks yielded small, heartbreaking pieces of evidence. A single shoe, strands of hair, broken jewelry, but nothing that pointed to the person responsible. The public was shaken, though not yet gripped by the full scale of fear that would follow. Newspapers ran cautious headlines, reporting the discovery of more bodies, but holding back from speculating about a serial killer. Among the women who worked Seattle streets, however, word spread quickly. Someone was hunting them. The name Green River Killer appeared in print that summer, and it would soon become a fixture of the region's consciousness. But in those first months, the monster was still a shadow. A nameless, faceless figure who moved unseen through the night and left only bodies in his wake. By September 1982, it was clear that Seattle had a serial killer in its midst. More bodies had been found, this time not just along the Green River, but scattered in wooded areas and secluded spots throughout King County. The victims now numbered at least 6, all strangled, all young women, all last seen alive in the same neighborhood south of downtown. The King County Sheriff's Office was overwhelmed. Detectives, already juggling routine cases, now found themselves trying to track what looked like a highly organized predator who left no clues. The case was consuming more and more resources with no end in sight. That autumn, the department officially formed the Green River Task Force, a dedicated team of investigators whose sole focus would be catching the killer. The unit was led by Sergeant Dave Reichert, one of the first detectives to respond to the discovery of Wendy Caulfield's body in July. Reichert was young and determined, and he took the killings personally. Working alongside him were dozens of officers, analysts, and forensic specialists. One of the senior figures who later became crucial to the investigation was Robert Keppel, a detective who had already worked on the Ted Bundy case years earlier. Keppel brought a quiet authority and a belief in the then-emerging field of criminal profiling. The task force worked out of a cramped operations room inside the sheriff's office. Maps of King County lined the walls, covered in pins and notes marking the locations where each body had been discovered. Photos of victims and timelines of their last known movements were pinned to corkboards. Filing cabinets overflowed with reports, interviews, and evidence logs. For months, the team worked long hours, chasing every lead, interviewing family members, combing through records of missing women. Patrol officers stepped up surveillance in the areas where women had gone missing. Undercover stings were carried out in hopes of luring the killer out of hiding. But for every step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps back. Witnesses described a variety of vehicles and vague, conflicting descriptions of men seen talking to the victims. Anonymous tips flooded the hotline. Hundreds of names, thousands of phone calls, nearly all of them dead ends. As 1983 arrived and the body count rose, so too did public anxiety. Local papers began to openly speculate about a serial killer. Families of missing women began holding vigils, pleading for information and justice. Inside the task force's office, detectives felt the pressure mounting. They were hunting a phantom, and every day he remained free meant another woman might not come home. Still, the team pressed on. They believed they were closing in, even as the killer stayed one step ahead. By late 1983, the Green River Task Force had identified more than a dozen victims. The killing showed no sign of stopping. The detectives were overwhelmed by the scope of the case, but among the chaos, patterns began to emerge. The victims were almost exclusively young women, many teenagers, most working in the sex trade or living transient lives. They tended to vanish from a cluster of streets in Seattle's South End, usually at night, often after accepting a ride from an unknown man. The locations where their bodies were found also began to form a disturbing map. Secluded, wooded areas, often near water. Some dump sites held more than one body, suggesting that the killer was revisiting places, using them again and again. These patterns didn't point to a specific name, but they suggested a specific kind of mind. Detective Robert Keppel, who had joined the task force, believed that the key to catching the Green River Killer lay in understanding his psychology. Keppel was one of the first American detectives to embrace psychological profiling, a new and controversial tool at the time. To supplement their work, Keppel and his colleagues even turned to an unlikely source, Ted Bundy. At that time, Bundy was on death row in Florida, awaiting execution. He had grown notorious in the Pacific Northwest a decade earlier for his own string of murders, and Keppel believed Bundy might offer insight into the mind of a serial killer. In 1984, Keppel and Reichert traveled to Florida to interview him. Bundy agreed to speak. For hours, Bundy talked about what motivated him, what drove men like him to kill, and how they chose their victims. He speculated that the Green River Killer was revisiting his dump sites to relive the murders, perhaps even to move or pose the bodies. He suggested that the killer would likely feel compelled to keep killing, even as police closed in. While Bundy's insights were chilling, they didn't lead to an immediate breakthrough. But his words did reinforce the detectives' growing belief that they weren't chasing a man who killed impulsively. This was someone deliberate, organized, methodical, and deeply practiced at blending in. Back in Seattle, the task force worked to refine their profile. They began to believe the killer was likely a white male in his 30s, with a working-class job that gave him access to a vehicle and familiarity with the remote areas where he left his victims. It was a start, but nothing concrete. The list of suspects only grew longer. And outside, the killer continued to hunt. By 1984, the Green River Killer had claimed more than 20 known victims. The true number detectives suspected was even higher. The case was no longer just a police matter. It was a cloud hanging over the entire city. For the women who worked Seattle streets, fear became a constant companion. Word spread quickly that someone was targeting them. Some stopped working entirely, too afraid to go out at night. Others tried to travel in pairs or carry weapons. But they all knew that even a moment of trust, getting into the wrong car, could mean never coming home. Local community groups began speaking out, criticizing law enforcement for not doing enough to protect vulnerable women. There were vigils and protests. Mothers whose daughters were missing stood before news cameras, holding photographs and begging for answers. For families of the victims, the grief was compounded by the stigma surrounding the case. Many of the women killed had worked as sex workers, and their deaths were sometimes dismissed as an occupational hazard. Families pushed back, insisting their daughters and sisters were more than the labels assigned to them. They were human beings whose lives mattered. The media played its part in shaping public perception. Newspapers ran stories almost daily, with lurid headlines and lists of names and ages. Radio talk shows debated what kind of person could commit such crimes. On television, reporters stood in front of crime scenes as detectives combed the woods behind them. Even for those who had no direct connection to the victims, the killings created a pervasive sense of unease. Seattle's famously rainy nights seemed darker. Parents warned their daughters to be cautious, even in seemingly safe neighborhoods. The idea that someone could prey on so many people for so long without being caught unsettled everyone. Inside the Green River Task Force, the human toll was felt too. Detectives worked long hours, sifting through files, chasing leads that went nowhere, interviewing people who lied, misled, or simply didn't know anything useful. The weight of failure gnawed at them. Each new body found was another reminder that they were losing the race. For the city as a whole, the case marked a turning point. It exposed how little protection existed for people on the margins, and how easily their disappearances could be ignored until the scale of tragedy became impossible to overlook. But the killer thrived in that very environment. While Seattle reeled, he continued, silent, calculating, and unseen. By the mid-1980s, the Green River Task Force had grown into one of the largest homicide investigations in American history. Hundreds of detectives, forensic experts, and analysts had worked the case. Yet the killer remained at large. Each passing year brought new victims and new frustration. The task force interviewed thousands of potential suspects. Men who fit the profile were brought in, questioned, fingerprinted, and sometimes even placed under surveillance. They investigated taxi drivers, long-haul truckers, construction workers, and countless others who lived or worked near the dump sites. Detectives even conducted polygraph tests on key suspects. But the killer, whoever he was, seemed to have no criminal record, no traceable evidence, no witness who could definitively identify him. Every promising lead seemed to collapse. One name that did surface more than once was Gary Ridgway. In 1983, Ridgway had been questioned by police after being spotted with one of the victims shortly before she disappeared. He denied any involvement, and when he agreed to take a polygraph test, he passed. With no evidence to hold him, detectives let him go. At the time, no one suspected just how close they had come. Meanwhile, the bodies continued to appear. By the end of the 1980s, the official victim count had climbed into the 30s. Some were discovered years after they had been killed. Their remains scattered and weathered, leaving little to help identify them. Others were never found at all. As the investigation dragged into the 1990s, public attention began to fade. New crimes and new tragedies dominated the headlines. The Green River Task Force was scaled back, its ranks thinned as resources were diverted elsewhere. For the detectives who remained on the case, it was disheartening work. They had dedicated years of their lives, sacrificed time with their families, and endured the daily weight of failure. Some retired without ever seeing justice served. Families of the victims, too, were left in limbo. Many clung to the hope that one day they would have answers, that their daughter's killer would be brought to justice. Others, weary from decades of grief, simply stopped speaking publicly. The Green River Killer became more of a ghost story than an active threat in the minds of many. But for those still searching for him, there was no forgetting. The hunt continued, quietly, doggedly, even as the trail grew colder. By the late 1990s, the Green River case had been active for nearly 2 decades. Dozens of women were dead, and the killer had vanished into ordinary life, or so it seemed. But quietly, technology was catching up to him. Forensic science had evolved dramatically since the early days of the investigation. DNA analysis, once unreliable and expensive, was becoming a standard tool for solving cold cases. Evidence collected years earlier, carefully preserved by the task force, was now being re-examined. Among the items revisited were samples from several victims' bodies, traces of saliva, semen, and other biological material. In 2001, the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory began running these samples through new DNA profiling techniques, hoping they would yield a match. They did. On November 30th, 2001, detectives arrested Gary Ridgway outside the truck plant where he worked. The DNA evidence linked him conclusively to the murders of 4 of the Green River victims. For the task force, it was a moment of quiet vindication. Ridgway had been on their radar for years, interviewed back in 1983 and again in later years, but he had slipped through their grasp each time. Now science had caught what traditional police work could not. At first, Ridgway denied everything. In interviews, he seemed calm, almost detached, claiming he knew nothing about the killings. But as the evidence mounted, his story began to crack. He eventually admitted to knowing some of the victims, though he still insisted he hadn't killed them. Detectives knew better. The DNA was irrefutable, and his patterns of behavior aligned perfectly with the long-established profile of the killer. The arrest made headlines across the country. Seattle residents who had long stopped following the case were stunned to learn the killer had been living among them the entire time, working a steady job, married, living in a modest home. It was a sobering reminder of how easily evil can hide in plain sight. For the families of the victims, the arrest was bittersweet. Many felt relief that someone was finally being held accountable. But others struggled with the realization that no arrest could bring their loved ones back, and no confession could erase the years of pain and unanswered questions. Even as Ridgway sat in custody, the full scale of his crimes was still unknown. Detectives suspected the 4 confirmed murders were just the beginning. They pressed him for more, and soon, Ridgway began to talk. Once Gary Ridgway was faced with the evidence against him, the question was no longer whether he was the Green River Killer, but how many lives he had taken. At first, Ridgway remained evasive. In early interrogations, he admitted only to what detectives could already prove. But as they offered him the possibility of avoiding the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation, his demeanor began to change. He started to talk. In long, matter-of-fact interviews, Ridgway described how he chose his victims. He targeted women he thought no one would miss. Young runaways, sex workers, people who he believed would not be reported missing quickly. He confessed to strangling most of his victims shortly after picking them up. Often, he would pretend to be a customer, gain their trust just enough to get them alone, and then kill them in secluded spots or even in his own home. What shocked detectives most was his calmness. Ridgway showed little emotion as he recounted details of murders, describing in clinical terms how he moved the bodies, sometimes returning days later to reposition or cover them. He admitted to revisiting dump sites not just to hide evidence, but also to relive the crime. The numbers were staggering. In total, Ridgway eventually confessed to killing 71 women. Of those, 49 were officially confirmed through evidence and identification, making him the most prolific convicted serial killer in history at that time. His memory for details was unsettling. Even decades later, he could describe the locations of bodies, the clothes victims wore, and the order in which he killed them. He helped lead detectives to previously undiscovered remains, bringing closure, if only partial, to families who had waited years for answers. And yet, even as he confessed, Ridgway seemed to see himself as ordinary. He told detectives he killed because it was easy and because he wanted to eliminate prostitutes. He insisted he was a good husband and employee, despite the double life he had led for decades. For the investigators who had spent their careers chasing him, hearing him speak was a chilling experience. The killer they had imagined, a menacing figure lurking in the shadows, turned out to be a mild-mannered man who blended into the crowd. His words painted a picture of evil not as dramatic or theatrical, but as methodical, patient, and disturbingly mundane. Gary Ridgway's arrest and confessions set the stage for one of the most consequential criminal proceedings in Washington state history. By the time he stood before a judge, he had already agreed to a plea bargain. In exchange for sparing him the death penalty, Ridgway would plead guilty to dozens of murders and help locate as many victims as possible. On November 5, 2003, Ridgway entered a Seattle courtroom and admitted his guilt. The room was silent as he calmly recited guilty again and again, 48 times, one for each charge read aloud. Some relatives of the victims sobbed quietly. Others sat motionless, staring at him. The sheer number of names spoken in that courtroom made the magnitude of his crimes impossible to ignore. In his prepared statement, Ridgway claimed he had saved lives by agreeing to cooperate. He portrayed his own confession as a service to the families and the community. Many found his words hollow. Victims' families were given the opportunity to address him directly during the sentencing phase. One by one, they stood before the court, describing the pain he had caused, the lives he had destroyed, and the years they had spent waiting for justice. Some expressed rage. Others, unexpectedly, offered forgiveness. One father told Ridgway he wished him a long life behind bars, so he could think every day about what you've done. On December 18, 2003, the judge handed down 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. It was, in effect, a life sentence for each victim, and a guarantee that Ridgway would die in prison. For the task force and the families, the sentencing was both an ending and a beginning. An ending to the hunt that had consumed 2 decades of their lives, and a beginning of living with the reality that justice, though served, could never undo the loss. After sentencing, Ridgway was transferred to the Washington State Penitentiary, where he remains today. Occasionally, he has assisted in identifying more remains, though many believe he still holds back the full truth. For Seattle, the conclusion of the case was a moment of reckoning. It exposed vulnerabilities in how society protects the marginalized and left behind questions that have yet to be fully answered. The Green River Killer was behind bars, but the scars he left would endure. In the years following his conviction, experts and investigators continued to study Gary Ridgway. His case became a benchmark in criminal psychology, a rare opportunity to understand how such prolific evil could coexist with outward normalcy. Ridgway defied many of the stereotypes surrounding serial killers. He wasn't especially charismatic, nor did he seek attention. He didn't have an obvious criminal record. To his neighbors, co-workers, and even his wives, he appeared ordinary, quiet, hardworking, sometimes aloof, but not threatening. Yet beneath that facade was a methodical predator who admitted he couldn't stop. Psychologists who interviewed him described him as emotionally shallow and compulsively deceptive. Ridgway himself said he targeted sex workers because he thought he could get away with it. They were less likely to be missed, less likely to generate public outrage. He rationalized his murders as cleaning up the streets, though investigators saw this as a thin excuse for deep-seated misogyny and a need for control. He planned carefully, and his killings followed a consistent pattern. He carried extra clothes to change into after murders. He dumped bodies in clusters to confuse investigators. Sometimes he left decoy evidence, chewing gum wrappers, cigarette butts, even though he didn't smoke. He also admitted to returning to dump sites after the murders, sometimes to move bodies, sometimes to engage in necrophilic acts. This behavior reinforced what profilers had suggested decades earlier, that revisiting crime scenes was part of his compulsion. His ability to maintain a double life was perhaps most chilling. During the height of his killing spree, Ridgway worked full-time at a truck plant, attended family gatherings, and even remarried. He could murder a woman on his lunch break and return to work as if nothing had happened. The Green River Task Force's profile, developed years before his arrest, had been strikingly accurate. A white male, working class, familiar with the area, likely married, and organized in his methods. Yet even with that profile, catching him proved elusive. For law enforcement, the case underscored the limits of profiling as a tool. It could guide an investigation, but it could not replace hard evidence. Ridgway's story remains a sobering example of how unremarkable a killer can seem, how someone capable of extraordinary harm can hide behind the mask of the mundane. And it is that ordinariness, perhaps, that makes his crimes so unsettling. The story of the Green River Killer is not just about Gary Ridgway. It is about the dozens of women whose lives were cut short and whose families endured years of grief and uncertainty. It is about a city forced to confront the vulnerability of its most marginalized residents. And it is about the quiet persistence of investigators who refused to let the trail go cold. Even with Ridgway behind bars, questions linger. How many victims remain undiscovered? How many families are still waiting for answers? The Green River case also left a deeper, more troubling truth. That evil often hides not in shadows, but in plain sight, in the face of a neighbor, a co-worker, a husband. For law enforcement, the lessons learned shaped how future serial crimes were investigated. For the rest of us, it remains a reminder to look closer and to remember the lives behind the headlines. The river is quiet now, but its banks still bear the memory of what happened there. So what do you think of today's video? Do you have something you want us to feature next? Tell us in the comments. It will also mean a lot to us if you like and subscribe. Close the book if you can. This is Black Chapter